Welcome to yet another episode of the NewSpace India podcast. Covering space as a part of journalism can be extremely challenging because one, you have to deal with collecting and collating information that is given by an organization like ISRO and then present it to the public, and very often you are dealing with limited information. On the other side, you also need to have a very good grip on the fundamentals of space activities and how they affect the public. In this episode of the NewSpace India podcast, I talked to my friend Vasudevan Mukunth, who is the science editor of The Wire, about the challenges in journalism while covering space as a sector in India. Vasu, welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast. Thank you very much for taking some time out to recording this episode with me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, NP.
You have been covering a lot of the related aspects for space for The Wire for quite some time now.
Yeah.
I wanted to get a feeling from you on what do you think journalistically, the quality of journalism of people covering space. Do you think, when you compare that with many other regions or journalists across the world, what do you think is the difference between the landscape of journalists covering space in India versus others?
I think a big determinant of the shape of this landscape is the extent to which and the quality of the information that is available in the public domain, or even if not in the public domain, to journalists. For example, I recently saw Emily Lakdawala's tweets on Twitter where she had described, her visit to see the Mars 2020 rover up close at NASA's invitation. And I found out shortly after that ISRO had done something similar with Chandrayaan 2. But beyond that itself, the amount of information that's coming out of ISRO does not support in-depth journalism, at least not until you can expend a lot more resources and a lot more time pursuing such stories. Because the quality and the amount of information coming out is not sufficient, as well as the access to ISRO scientists and other space scientists in India is not sufficient. I mean, of course, there are notable exceptions. For example, you have astrophysicists from the Indian Institute of Astrophysics in Bangalore. So aside from that, that I would say is the biggest difference. The amount of information that we work with to compose our stories. For example, I mean, these are all sort of canonical examples in India, in the sense that, people always talk about how ISRO came out and did a lot of outreach and, undertook a lot of sort of publicity exercises just ahead of the launch of its Mars orbiter mission. I think that was 2013, 14. But then after the mission launched, everything completely dropped off. And all that we had coming out of the Mars orbiter mission was basically sporadic photos, some this or that scientific paper once in a while. But aside from that, there's not been much. And the same thing, I think, is happening now. Or maybe it's too soon to say with Chandrayaan 2, but, I don't think anybody's going to be surprised if, this continues to be the state of affairs with Chandrayaan 2. So, this I would say is the biggest difference. Now, the more information that you put out in the public domain, the more stories. It's not just that, you have journalists or writers who are going to cover stories based on that information. They're not just going to say, ISRO just said this and it becomes a report. No. I mean, there are a lot of different ways in which you can put different bits of information together to compose different kinds of stories. So basically, that sort of variety is lacking right now, which I think is a direct function of the amount of information that journalists have to work with. So that would I say is the principal difference.
So that is, of course, the aspect of the amount of information that is put out by ISRO. But the other bit is, of course, I would also argue for the training of journalists and the training of people who are doing science journalism itself.
No, yeah, definitely there is a qualitative difference there. So if you zoom in a little, yes, that's what it looks like. There are two sets of problems. One set has to do with the amount of information that's available. The other set has to do with, how well journalists themselves are able to cover the space sector. But to me, if you zoom out a little bit, both these things are connected. The more information you put out, the better journalism there is going to be.
Absolutely, yeah.
And in fact, even complaining about how, journalists, for example, there was this thing recently, I think it was with Chandrayaan, I'm not exactly sure, had to do with basically how Satish Dhawan was sort of lampooned in the press when the SLV failed. I think there is somewhat of a greater understanding right now about how difficult it is to work stuff like space. But at the same time, to me, yeah, like I said earlier, both these things are connected. The more information you put out, the better journalism there is going to be. Because people will also have to sort of, like when you starve the public of information or when you starve journalists of information, what happens is that they start inventing. They have their incentives that incentivize invention. You have otherwise you have nationalistic stuff like the sort that happened after the Chandrayaan 2 surface mission failed. If there had been more information in the public domain then there would have been a lot less room to be able to go out on a limb and say, Indians might walk on the moon someday, or the whole mission was a 95% success, stuff like that.
Yeah, sure. So when you look at the lack of information itself, do you think that's a very policy level decision, or is this something that is by nature not just a fact of the way ISRO as an institution works, or is this across the board for every organization supported by the government for research?
In India, yes, that much is true. But I don't know if it's a policy level thing. Yeah, there are some policy level problems in the sense that, for example, there is a government policy that pertains to DST institutions, which basically says that, and DSIR institutions, of course, the CSIR, etc., which basically says that unless you are criticizing some government initiative or policy, all scientists are free to speak to the press without having to seek the permissions of the superiors or whatever. But at ISRO, I don't know it appears to me that that's not the case, because people there seem to be a lot more tight-lipped. For example, even as we saw recently during the Chandrayaan 2 events in September, was that you had news sources quoting unnamed ISRO officials, which sort of rouses suspicion that it's maybe a form of access journalism, or the stories were being planted. Or, more often than not, the only named person who was speaking to the press was K. Sivan, who's the chairman. So yeah, certainly there is a policy level problem. And aside from that, yeah, there is also a resource level problem in the sense that, NASA has a lot more to work with. It is a much, much larger organization than ISRO itself. And at that scale, with those resources, yes, it's able to accomplish a lot more. But that cannot be an excuse to not even improve over time. For example, very, very little things. For example, the quality of the cameras that ISRO uses around its launch pad. Or for example, it's only very recently set up the viewing gallery at Sriharikota. So, I also heard that recently they've stopped sending out their quarterly newsletters. So it seems like it's a combination of both things, policy as well as resources. But even when there are opportunities, even when there appear to be opportunities, when the organization can do better, more often than not, it does not, which does not inspire much confidence,
Do you think it's a matter of protecting some kind of national interest, in the sense that this is all related to some sort of a security issue, or that is one of the reasons why most of these policymakers back out from sharing any of this information? Or
if that is their prime concern, and if it is a legitimate concern, then I would ask them to at least specify the boundary conditions. Tell me where information will drop off, instead of this near constant ambiguity where I don't know one world ends and the other one begins. At least if you tell me that, this is how much we can share with you for these reasons, just draw the line somewhere and always hold that line, then it's fine. But you don't have that, right? It seems almost as if something bad happens, then suddenly a line appears. It seems like a red herring. Even if there is that strong demarcation that's available, that's only good for everyone, right? If you have a civilian space program, it's good to sort of separate that from a military program. And so at all levels, that distinction should be strong, and it should be specified that we may not be able to tell you exactly what happened, but this is the reason, and we will always hold this line. If that was the case, that's easier to work with, because that has a greater sense of predictability. You know what to expect and what not to expect, but that doesn't seem to be the case. There's a lot of ambiguity about a lot of things.
Let's talk about actually also the access to journalism itself. So when you talked about getting information and making available information, one of the things that could be interesting, if there's no policy of an organization to put out information, is for people to then ask questions to people in that organization, right? So
right.
In that sense, when you look at who gets access to ISRO, either it could be interviews, or it could be like TV blurbs or things like that. It's only a very select group of people in India at the moment. And I think that really impedes the kind of questions that they ask and the kind of narrative that they put out, because there isn't any culture of asking very strong questions, and in fact, more important than that, very strong follow-up.
Right.
The question here is, how could we evolve this ecosystem where people can ask questions and, more importantly, very good follow-ups?
Okay, so I should start off by saying that there is no shortage of questions. And there is no shortage of people who want to ask follow-up questions as well, who want to follow a story for a long time. But irrespective of what we want to do, unless the people on the other side of the aisle sort of open themselves up, none of this matters. Because even now, for example, if I had to say that someone was practicing access journalism, so that they are allowed access to someone within ISRO to speak to, and there is a sort of implicit agreement that the journalist will not ask any tough questions. Even in that sort of setup, the incentive there is access. And that incentive should be removed. I mean, journalists also, you're expected to publish a lot of stories. And if the only way you can get stories about the space program is if you suck up to it, then that's not going to work. So the people on the other side really have to open themselves up. That's the only way out. You and I are part of, many circles, having to do with space and space flight and stuff like that. We have many circles in common. And even if you look there is no shortage of people there is no shortage of tough questions. But always the bottleneck is that where do you ask them? There is the occasional press conference, but even then questions are limited. And aside from that, you really have to, move through informal channels and such. So if the other side does not open itself up to questions, I think right now the ball is in their court, waiting for them to act.
So do you think, the kind of journalism, for example, that you do a lot of pieces that are kind of very good critiques of many of the aspects of the space program, and you ask kind of interesting questions and also deliberate on interesting information that is lying all around you, and you piece it together. So I feel like this is more of a citizen science journalism rather than because you're kind of forced to do citizen science journalism.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you don't have access to people. You can't talk to them directly and get your questions answered. So you Google and talk to other people, stuff like that. Yeah.
One of the interesting things there is actually, let's take an example, for example, right? So when you look at from, an ISRO's perspective, or from a high-level policymaker or a decision maker within the government, let's say when you ask a basic question like, tell me how many operational satellites are today working in space, which are Indian assets. And that could be a very tricky question to them, because somebody who is kind of a person who says, okay, this is a piece of information that is related to the security of the country or the kind of services that these satellites provide, may say, I don't want to tell that piece of information publicly. And so that kind of data that it fades away from the public, and it's not available then. But then it's kind of shooting ourselves in the foot, because every other country has enough number of assets in space that tells them which asset is functional or not functional. So I think when it comes to how these play out, I often feel that this is kind of the format of how conversations evolve, and most of the time the lack of information is we kind of shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah, no, I mean, that thing you mentioned about how other countries have various assets that make it easier to sort of deduce, how many satellites India might have, stuff like that, which we also saw with the Vikram lander incident. Those things are weird, actually, because there seems to be a mismatch in sort of, there seems to be a reluctance to acknowledge that the information is available via other, sources. So I really don't know how to make sense of that. I mean, if I had access to a scientist, I would be able to, not scientist, sorry, some senior person at ISRO. I would really like to ask them this. And I mean, these guys are really smart, and they must know that even if they don't say something, it must be there are other ways to obtain that information, other very legal ways to obtain that information. So I also wonder sometimes if they don't say it because they don't know whether they're allowed to say it. Because, for example, when the ASAT test happened, that was, I think, the first time you had someone from DRDO come out and talk about space stuff, at least in recent years. Whereas for everything else, we're going to ISRO every time something goes up into space. Whereas ISRO is supposed to be, at least, certainly to a large extent, a civilian space program. I'm sure it also works with the military, although I don't know for sure, but yeah. So the thing I'm trying to get at is that, I'm curious if there is sort of a clearance issue involved, whether these guys are simply playing it safe by not coming out and sharing all that they can. Whether, there is some other level of information control that we're missing here.
What are the kind of tools that you use today to pick up information and process it? And, given the state of affairs, what platforms, tools do you use to pick up information around a theme that you're working and then put out your piece?
Well, the first thing is Google. So recently, I also started using Celestrak. I started working with playing around with TLEs, figuring out how satellites are mapped and what kind of information you can infer from these. These tool and element sets are available in the public domain. I didn't know that, and you can get that data for all satellites that are up there, even for pieces of satellites as well as for debris. And after the ASAT test, I sort of started playing around with that, and that's been sort of a rich source of information. Apart from that, piecing together these stories is basically, I also use a couple crawlers, both sort of off the shelf that I use, because many of these documents that are available on the ISRO website, I shouldn't say ISRO website, they're available on a government domain, but they're not always easily findable. But they're still, not password protected or any such thing. Crawlers have been useful to sort of dig up those documents. You just let them run on a particular domain and throw up all the PDFs that are available. So that's been, and apart from that, of course, there is Twitter, WhatsApp, last but definitely not the least, Reddit. The groups on Reddit, the ISRO subreddit in particular, is fantastic. There are a lot of people, a lot of very knowledgeable people discussing stuff there by themselves, mostly sort of pulling together the little bits that each of them knows so that together they know a lot. And if you visit that subreddit, you'll be able to see, there is a little tidbit that comes out from ISRO, some senior ISRO member who spoke somewhere in a conference and said something. And suddenly you have a lot of people jumping on that and sort of stitching it together with other details that they remember from different times to piece together a story. For example, that's how I know everything I know about ISRO's reusable launch vehicles program. So yeah, this I would say is the, I wouldn't call it a toolkit, but yeah.
Let's look at the recent incident of the Chandrayaan, the lander, and the kind of information that was available post the live relay, and then the guy Shanmugam finding the spot. One of the interesting bits there is I ran through the video, some time ago of because I didn't watch it live. When I saw the YouTube video of it, and I realized that once at the very end, when the lander was kind of in the phase of the last 3 kilometers or something, and then it was getting intense, and after that people didn't know really what was going on so much.
Yeah,
and
the feed froze.
The kind of panic was also set in the room there, and for 15 or 20 minutes beyond that, there was some commentary going on in the background by the commentators, who were offering some of the comments related to the mission. But after that, there's a extremely long period of just deliberation, walking around, and people just shooting them, scientists just going around and talking to the prime minister and so on. So if you look at a lot of the accounts of even astronaut program in US, where they're going to the moon, and the press briefings always have two particular briefings that are ready. One which says astronauts have died, and the briefing is made according to that, and the statement is ready for it.
Right.
Or there's a statement that is ready for success, saying we have succeeded, and this is what happened, and this is what will continue happening.
Right.
And so it's every time that ISRO succeeds, you see this massive kind of statement, or massive speech that happens.
Right.
Where the chairman speaks for some 10 minutes, and then all the mission director and whoever the XYZ of the mission comes and speaks, and says this was a fantastic thing and an achievement and everything else. But when kind of failure strikes, you almost have no addressing of the failure, or no addressing of the the thoughts behind what could go on next, and what is the process next, and what could be the reason, and what we will be thinking about.
Right.
And so I think that's a cultural issue, right? I don't think so.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. No, it's certainly a cultural issue, and I think it's also has a bit to do with in terms of engaging with the media, and in terms of putting up spectacles. ISRO is still a very young organization compared to, for example, the European Space Agency or NASA. So if I had to sympathize, I would say that maybe they're not comfortable doing this yet. Maybe they don't have the right people right now for it. Because, for example, for a long time, the Indian space program was sort of in its developmental stages, and right now it's going out and executing things. Right now things have become a lot more spectacular. A lot more people tuning in, and also, of course, the mediums themselves have changed. Earlier, you had just TV and radio and newspapers, and now you have websites all over the place. You have blogs, you have video, you have podcasts, all sorts of things. So, if I had to cut them some slack, then I would do that, saying that then maybe they're not ready for prime time. Maybe they don't know how to deal with it, and that's why they respond this way. But that said, I mean, it cannot be an excuse altogether, because especially as we saw with Chandrayaan, which was sort of a recapitulation of Mars orbiter mission, but only more extreme. If it was a success, I mean, even in failures, they came up with some sort of impression of success, which was really bizarre. Especially Sivan coming out and saying that the mission was a 95% success, 98% success. I mean, even if they sort of went completely quiet, that would be better than coming out and trying to twist the narrative in ways that you can just see through them that they're false, that something is definitely not right. So even if they stayed completely quiet, that's fine. Just coming out and not twisting the narrative, that should not be done. I mean, it should not be done also from the point of view that you have some space journalists who are really sort of in the know and who understand how these things work, but there are others who are just who will just latch onto it and sort of broadcast it. And when you know that that's going to happen, a little more responsibility would have been good.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the interesting bits for me as a experience of Chandrayaan 2, especially the whole landing live, broadcast of that was. I was in Bangalore during that time, and
okay,
it was for me fascinating to see the amount of engagement of the media for a science or a space event across the language spectrum, across national news or local news or so on. So it was almost as if there was a live cricket match that was going on where India is playing some other country.
When they opened the viewing gallery for entry tickets, that thing was filling up really fast. Like it was a cricket stadium or something.
That really tells. And also, one of the interesting themes there is with the Chandrayaan 2, the lander, especially when you saw that even on YouTube or wherever, and people noticed that we didn't make it to the surface of the moon, the public never discouraged ISRO to saying, you guys have not done anything, right? They in fact, cheered them, saying this was a really good attempt. You should do it one more time. We are proud of you. And you can see all those comments there. So the reaction of people inside of ISRO is kind of opposite to that, because I guess they feel that maybe by not putting out information or something like that, they're guarding themselves from criticism.
Right, yeah.
But the public is actually not criticizing them for anything. In fact, they're encouraging them.
Yeah, nobody was criticizing them until they started saying those really weird things.
Yeah, and the other bit is, of course, when you look at the whole thing of losing the contact with the lander, for me, I think we lost an opportunity there of doing a nationwide public campaign of promoting scientific thinking and exploration by kind of setting up like a national-wide competition of finding the lander spot by releasing all the information. You could have then, put out a competition around it, and then that would have sparked a huge public interest.
Yeah, exactly. That would have been great PR for ISRO as well. They become obvious as lost opportunities when something like Chandrayaan 2 or something like that happens. But this sort of culture of putting out information in the public domain, for example, NASA has this thing about releasing images that its satellites or orbiters capture into the public domain within a specified time period, after processing or whatever. Or withhold, or if you're going to withhold it, then you must have your reasons to withhold it. I mean, it can't just be willy-nilly ad hoc stuff. When events like this come along, then you really start to realize, yes, okay, ISRO missed this opportunity. But the thing is, ISRO is missing opportunities every day. It's not just that they didn't do this during the Chandrayaan 2, surface mission failure thing. It's also that they're not doing this otherwise. For example, on Vikram Sarabhai's birthday, where they just updated their website and conducted a few events around the country. So stuff like that. So there are lots of opportunities. I mean, ISRO is amassing very large amounts of data. We have orbiters around Mars, around the moon. We have multiple around Earth. So every single day they can put out all of this information, instead of putting them behind a portal, instead of really just release them as a gallery, maybe under a less restrictive license. So yeah, so we realized during Chandrayaan 2 that, it could have done this. But the thing is, it needs to do this all the time. It won't be good PR. It wouldn't have been good PR on just this one occasion. There is a lot here to work with, and it's squandering thousands of opportunities.
And I think that's a kind of a policy decision that the chairman has to take, that that we will have a large public relations office within ISRO, not just one PR contact for the entire organization who manages everything.
Yes, definitely. And in fact, even that person usually very hard to access. Yeah, for example, when they had this launch viewing thing, they hosted this event, right, on September 7th, when the landing attempt was going to be made, and they invited a bunch of journalists over to watch and everything. So even to get access to that, you had to have some sort of a clearance from the state press bureau. So really, these very bureaucratic things. I understand where these things are coming from, but it needs to be a bit more looser than that, and not so. Well, in this case, it was bureaucratic, but in other situations, it might just have been paranoid. So that's sort of playing it safe and guarding yourself by not releasing information. All of these things are connected. Like you said earlier, all of these things are embedded in a common culture, and that needs to change, and that's going to take a lot of time and effort to change. But so need to keep pushing.
How effective do you think RTI is a tool, and do you leverage it for your journalism?
Not often, no. Mostly because, lack of mental bandwidth. But again, with RTIs also, off late, in the last few years at least, we've been seeing there have been reports, and I've heard many first as well as second-hand accounts of how the RTI is being weakened. Even when you file RTIs, you don't always get the information that you do. You need to phrase things a certain way. There is a lot of nuance and work that goes into this. But aside from that, again, that to me is a sort of red herring, in the sense that there is a lot of information that I shouldn't have to ask for. If you will give it to me, if I ask for it, that is fine, that is great. But I shouldn't have to ask for it. This is sort of reflection of the trustlessness concept that you have in some other fields. And I'm sure you're familiar with that, wherein, you shouldn't have to trust something to work a certain way. It should just work a certain way, and there should be no scope for failure. Similarly, I shouldn't have to ask for it, because even when you have something like RTIs, there are a lot of unknown unknowns. So you can ask for something only when you should ask for it. So RTIs, me personally, for space stories, not so much. But as a tool, are they effective? Perhaps. I would say, judge it on a case-to-case basis. There is no blank. I don't think I can say at a blanket level that, all of these requests you'll be able to strike gold. I think that is almost never the case, actually. And finally, you shouldn't have to ask for it. It should just be available. There's a similar story with the use of images, right? We saw this with those posters for TV shows that are, and the film, what is it, Mission Mangal, being made based on the Mars orbiter mission, wherein, show producers could not use ISRO images freely, even though there is no harm in doing that, especially when they're contextualizing it so properly. So those sort of restrictions should also be removed. There is a specific license on those images designed by the government of India. I forget the exact name right now, but there is no reason that these visual assets have to be on such restrictive reuse licenses. They can very easily be on a Creative Commons license. But I don't understand why that is not the case. For example, I cannot put the picture of the PSLV or the ISRO logo on my T-shirt. I should be able to do that, and I would like to collect souvenirs like that, but those things are not available, which is quite sad.
Common people can't access, scientists the way that we want to access. The other way to do it is to do it through your public representatives or politicians. So, for example, right. So when you look at, for example, the US, there are certain groups of people in the US who are senators or, congressmen who represent the space industry and who represent the voice of the space. And so they ask these questions to the NASA administrator and, whoever is responsible for the space program, saying, give me an answer for these questions and as to where is the direction we're going. Are we going to the moon? Are we going to the Mars? Are we going XYZ? What are the missions that we're doing? How are we progressing? Are we competitive enough against China or whichever country our space assets good? So there's a lot of deliberation there because, for example, the Vice President Mike Pence of the US is a very strong space advocate. There's also another guy from Texas, who's a very strong proponent for the space industry. In India, that's the thing, right? So you have almost zero representatives who are in the public who understand anything in the space sector, can follow along and ask questions that are relevant and in public domain. And so one of the interesting things that I was thinking about is that the only way that that could be set up in India in a way that we already have in terms of institutions is through the parliamentary committee. Because the parliamentary committee is the one that is overseeing a lot of ISRO activities, and they are a bunch of across the board representatives from all the parties.
Right.
And if the public, when questions through the RTI are kind of diluted, the answers are diluted, and there's no access, to asking questions and asking follow-ups. The only way that could be done is through the parliamentary committee setting up a kind of a Q&A session or something like that, where they could ask questions that people could then ask questions to them, and then they could ask those questions, and ISRO should be able to then answer it.
Right. Yeah, this sounds workable, but again, it's also amusing the extent to which we need to go in the absence of simple press conferences, regular press conferences by ISRO itself.
Yeah, but that's the only way I would say. I would say something like this workable, because the involvement of the policymakers are also very important. Because let's say ISRO just does press conferences and there's no there's not much presence or interest from the policymakers. Then you have no independent thinking by the policymakers on any of the issues, and they'll only go with what the people in ISRO suggest them.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I see what you mean. But my contention is that, that seems like a more higher level event. And that shouldn't have to be the case, because when that happens, there's no guarantee that it's going to be regular. There's no guarantee that it's going to be even very accessible. You see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting topic to see in the future, because one of the things that I see, which is a very strong possibility for change in the space program, is actually the really good involvement of people who can understand the space program and may ask intelligent questions and are public representatives.
Right. Yeah. I mean, right now the most you see is some Lok Sabha question and answer session. Yeah, we definitely need more than that.
When you look at actually the landscape of information, especially public domain information, there is a lot of people out there who are doing independent thinking. They are putting out a lot of public domain information through means that they are collecting independently. So we have, I think, none of them who are equivalents of that in India. So, for example, let's take T.S. Kessler, the guy who runs Celestrak, right? So, or the guy from Harvard Smithsonian, Jonathan McDowell.
McDowell, yeah, 4589, right?
So there's no equivalence of that to India. I think that's one of the major drawbacks I see, that we should have more people who are doing that sort of a work, which is putting that sort of information out.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, this is very interesting. Okay. I mean, so I was going to say that, there are, I mean, I don't know any of the real names. For example, Shanmugha Subramaniam now, who sort of everyone is familiar with now. So if you follow his posts on Reddit, he basically describes, the different kinds of details that he's putting together in order to, for example, after he found the Vikram lander, he said he was going to look for the Chandrayaan 1 impactor probe, the site where it crashed. And I mean, T.S. Kelso and Jonathan McDowell have put together very large data sets of the things that they're following. For example, I mean, both of them regularly sort of stay up to date and post updates about objects that have recently entered orbit or that are behaving weirdly in orbit. But when it comes to sort of specific problems, you have a lot of these guys on the ISRO subreddit who basically piece together different kinds of information. So there is this one guy, let me just pull up his name, just give me a second. Shankar Vishwanathan. So he basically has been taking satellite, orbital position data and what we know about satellite, the mission profiles and their trajectories, where they were launched from, etc., to create animations that he's been uploading on GitHub and as well as on his website, where you can really see how these missions come together, and you can visualize things very easily. These things, you don't have to be an expert to use these animations or these interactive properties. So there's a lot you can learn just by fiddling around with this. So you have a lot of guys. It's just that they, number one, I don't think they have been around in the industry for a very long time, or at least not as long as someone like Gunther Krebs or T.S. Kelso have been, that they've been sort of pursuing. I don't want to call this a hobby, but this probably started off as a hobby. But they are also sort of collating a lot of this data, putting it together in specific contexts. And so I would say the Indian scene is not completely devoid of such people. It's just that they are few and far between. Again, I wish I didn't have to say this, but again, as a reflection of, the amount of data that they have to work with. So even among these guys, you see a preponderance of, you see a glut. So a lot of the stuff that these guys produce has to do with, missions that were carried out by ESA and NASA, because that's the information that's out there. Whereas, there is very little that I can put together about ISRO right now. But yeah, so there are these guys who are doing this sort of great work, but, again, there has to be a lot more information out. I mean, I don't know any other way to put it, actually.
I always try to do some sort of a comparison, because I see that, of course, the evolution of kind of people and also the kind of information that is putting out, we could, mature towards more open kind of society and a more open kind of information age. That's where the comparison is interesting, because if you look at Twitter or Reddit, the spaceflight Reddit subreddit, and also Twitter with these people, then the amount of information is really exhaustive and very, very interesting, and there's a lot of debate and discussion around that. I think this is an interesting topic, and perhaps you should even consider writing about it, the whole citizen science, and a comparison between the landscape of the US, for example, and the emergence of some of these people like
I recently wrote a profile of the people who are on the ISRO subreddit. I mean, I couldn't name any of them, but yeah, I spoke to them and basically how they got into this and everything. So these guys are there, not as prominent as Jonathan McDowell or Kelso, but they're there, which is heartening.
Of course, I'm looking for a day when there's an Indian equivalent of somebody like Curious Droid and Scott Manley, right? Who does quite a lot of interesting work, of kind of decluttering information on many of the space events, and kind of also piecing together a lot of information that is available, and putting out a kind of a narrative that people can actually understand as a whole bit, and don't need to actually spend hours reading it. Or so it's a kind of a very curated video of piecing together information, and not having to, let's say, normal people who don't follow subreddits or Twitter feeds or whatever, right? So for them, I think it's a very handy tool.
Right, definitely, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the wire itself and your efforts within the science section. What are your plans, for example, for space? And are you looking at expanding some of the efforts from just writing the journalistic pieces to doing more different kinds of
definitely
work?
So the moment we have more leeway in terms of expanding and stuff like that, one of the things that I would like to start doing right away is publish more educational material, because we cannot always, what you can and cannot write, what you can and cannot report on is limited by what the audience already does or does not know. So the more informed audience you have, the answers to more sophisticated questions you can share with them. So we want to sort of bridge the gap that we're seeing in terms of the extent to which there is an appreciation of space flight and satellite technologies and stuff like that. So we want to fix that by publishing more educational materials.
So by educational materials, what do you mean? Can you give some examples?
Well, the simplest and most readily available example is the explainer, but instead of textual, I would like to do more video explainers. And these are not just a bunch of pictures moving around. but somebody actually standing in front of a whiteboard and talking about something to explain little concepts in a minute. For example, the gravitational slingshot comes quickly to mind, and I mean, it's a really cool maneuver, but it's also really simple. And if more people understood how it worked, then you suddenly have room to talk about more sophisticated missions with fewer words in a shorter span of time. We also want to publish interactive visualizations wherein people can change, for example, to talk about orbital eccentricity. So basically, you have the ellipse and you have the major axis and minor axis, and if you vary these particular numbers as a planet goes around the sun or some other star, to see how its orbit changes, and to be able to intuitively understand why the orbital mechanics changes the way it does, or why the three-body problem is so complicated. So stuff like this, basically, that will allow us. I don't want to use the term to educate our audience, but to broaden their horizons. Education is something slightly different, but yeah, broaden their horizons so that we can then explore, whatever we've opened up together, instead of sticking to very simplistic news reports and stuff like that.
How do you think we could incentivize more people who are from ISRO and who retire at a senior level to be more active in journalism? So, because I think that's a very underrated thing at the moment. Because one of the interesting bits there is that since they have done the trade for like 30 or 35 years, and they have a lot more that they could share. Unfortunately, today I think a lot of the great minds, either they are forced to share something on Facebook on their, for example, what Tapan Mishra does, for example.
Right.
But unfortunately, a lot of these kind of people, when they come out, even for example, the former chairman of ISRO, or you could be some mission directors or project managers or whatever position, right?
I mean, you look at ISRO, you cannot separate ISRO from the chairman that have led it. And if you look at ISRO over the years, and then you talk about how it's been such a closed-off organization, I mean, there have been periods of relative openness, but mostly it's been marked by as an organization that lives behind very high walls. So this is when these senior ISRO employees sort of retire, there needs to be an acknowledgement that they need to take up communication. So I think that in itself is lacking. And you also, of course, have people coming out writing books, but most of the books that you see that have come out, especially the glut of books that have come out recently talking about ISRO's early days and talking about how the organization was under the leadership of Sarabhai and Dhawan and things like that. So that aside, you don't have many others writing books about stuff that has happened more recently, unless they're writing about it in technical terms. They're talking about rocketry or propellants or stuff like that. I think the only exception, as far as I know, was U.R. Rao's book. So I think that acknowledgement itself is missing, for them to sort of come out of the organization after such a long time and then say that, okay, I need to write something.
I want to end the podcast by asking you, what would be the things that you would look forward to as something that you would expect to change, or within your own journalism, or within the journalistic community, as well as from within ISRO?
Well, within ISRO, I mean, I think I've made my wish list clear. One thing I should say that I'm happy about is there are, I wouldn't say a lot more, but there are noticeably more news outlets that are publishing informed articles about the Indian space program. First Post comes to mind immediately. If you read around, you see a lot more publications that have something to say, whether it's an opinion or whether they're saying that ISRO says something. So that sort of has changed, because earlier I used to just read the Hindu, which and perhaps the Times of India, which I think would be the case with almost everyone. But whereas these days there are a lot more places to get your information from, a lot more people are interested, and that is showing up in the news cycle as well. So that is something that I'm happy about, and which I hope will continue to expand in the coming year. That a lot more publications will take this up, and a lot more publications will sort of, not simply just scratch the surface, but go deeper and ask the questions, and basically go on to criticize ISRO itself, instead of just portraying it as this amazing organization that's doing a lot of great work. I mean, that is true, but at the same time, there is also a lot left wanting. And And I'm hoping that as more and more people do this, ISRO will also feel encouraged, as well as I hope the relationship between the media and ISRO will improve to the extent that ISRO feels comfortable sort of stepping out and being friendlier with the media. So, I would say, I'm gladdened by that, and that is my hope for the coming year.
Thank you very much, Vasu, for taking an hour out. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and I hope you'll be covering a lot more space. And
definitely, yeah. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you for staying until the end. If you have any comments or suggestions, please write to curator@newspaceindia.com. Please consider sharing this episode with any friends or family who may be interested in learning about India's space activities. If you would like to stay in touch with the NewSpace India community, please use the link in the description to join the NewSpace India Telegram group. Feel free to also suggest guests for any future episodes. A new episode of the NewSpace India podcast is released every other Friday. Do subscribe to the podcast using Apple, Google, or any other podcasting platforms you may use. Until the next episode, thank you.